Afade, and welcome to the Guam Congress building, everyone. Thank you for being here today. The Committee on Health, Land, Justice, and Culture is called to order. This hearing was originally called on Monday, July 8th at 4 p.m., but was recessed because we were still in session. And today is Monday, July 15th, 2024, and it is about 4:10 p.m. In compliance with the open government law, the original notices were published in the Guam Daily Post and posted to the Government of Guam Public Notice Portal on Tuesday, February 20, on I'm sorry, that's not correct. Sorry. In compliance with the open government law, the notices for the public hearing were published in the Guam Daily Post and posted to the Government of Guam Public Notice Portal on Friday, June 28, 2024, and Friday, July 5th, 2024. Notices were also sent by email to all senators and all main media broadcasting outlets, and this hearing is being live streamed on the Guam Legislature's YouTube channel. I just ask that everyone, before testifying, please identify yourself for the record. So we have one agenda item for today. That is resolution number 433-37 COR. It's sponsored by myself. It's relative to requesting from the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Defense the unclassified version of the independent assessment of the integrated air and missile defense architecture to defend Guam, which was authorized by U.S. Public Law 117-263 and commissioned by the U.S. Department of Defense from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Lincoln Laboratory in 2023. For some background on this, the U.S. Missile Defense Agency is proposing to build a 360-degree enhanced integrated air and missile defense system in Guam. The system is expected to be split into 20 sites across the island. The 20 sites, according to the Department of Defense, have been selected based on, quote, extensive siting studies to confirm alternative site selection, optimize system performance, and optimize facility planning and design, unquote. DoD has also stated that in the event where DoD property is not available to strategically locate the components on DoD properties, or where buffer and safety zone arcs encroach on non-federal properties, acquisition of appropriate real estate interests on non-federal property may be needed in a few areas, unquote. DoD has also stated that, quote, site selection is evolving and additional sites may be considered, unquote. The proposed 360-degree enhanced missile system will be composed of different components. System components include radars and sensors. Combined expected capabilities include 360-degree coverage for threat acquisition, track, and discrimination for ballistic, hypersonic, and cruise missile defense. Number 2, command and control. Includes weapons and radar command, control, and decision. Overhead and sensor data, and situational awareness to warfighters and weapon systems. Number 3, launchers. Army launchers, M903 launchers, indirect fires protection capability, multi-mission launchers. Combined expected capabilities include utilization for ballistic, hypersonic, and cruise missile defense. Number 4, associated support facilities and infrastructure, including power plants, fuel storage facilities, water storage facilities, and life support facilities, including family housing, fire stations, and dining facilities, would also be constructed and operated on these sites to support the proposed EIAMD components and accommodate personnel associated with the proposed system. So those are the 4 components of the EIAMD system, or the Enhanced Integrated Air and Missile Defense System in Guam. There was a scoping period which takes place before the Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, process for the 360-degree system began, and that scoping period began on May 5th and ended on August 18th, 2023. The period was extended due to Typhoon Mawar. The Legislative Committee on Health, Land, Justice, and Culture, and the Committee on Public Safety, and the Committee on the Environment jointly held a public hearing chaired by myself, Senator Chris Barnett, and Senator Sabina Perez, respectively, for the public, local government leaders, and U.S. military representatives on July 17, 2023, to discuss the proposed system before the project scoping period ended. Little was learned from this town hall in terms of the proposed system's components, locations, and implications, but many questions were raised concerning health, public land access, private land use, environment, and purpose. In January 2024, the MDA published a final Enhanced Integrated Air and Missile Defense System on Guam Environmental Impact Statement, Public Involvement Scoping Summary Report. The report gave this brief overview of the scoping periods. They list the 3 scoping meetings, the first one on August 2nd, 2023 at Hilton, 114 attendees and 12 written comments. Scoping meeting 2 on August 3rd, Micronesian Mall, 60 attendees, 14 written comments. Scoping meeting 3, August 4th, 2023, Hagat Community Center, 30 attendees, 5 written and 1 oral comment. That's according to the summary by the MDA. The scoping period for the proposed 360-degree EIAMD system received in total 136 public comments. Comments submitted by the same person or group more than once via different methods were only counted once. They categorized in their report the content that the public comments were placed into, including, there are 18 of them: protection of Guam, air quality, public health and safety impacts, transportation, socioeconomics, environmental justice and the protection of children, mitigation measures, cultural resources, water resources, airspace management, land use, visual resources, recreation, noise and vibration, geological resources, terrestrial biological resources, infrastructure and utilities, and general project concerns or categories. So we are now waiting for the MDA to release their draft EIS for public review. EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement. According to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, EIS process, the draft EIS should provide a detailed description of the proposal, the purpose and need, reasonable alternatives, the affected environment, and present analysis of the anticipated beneficial and adverse environmental effects of these alternatives. Following a formal comment period and receipt of comments from the public and other agencies of at least 45 days on that draft EIS, the final EIS will be developed and issued. I just want to remind everyone, we've had this situation many times over the past 10 years. 10 years ago, we had an 11,000-page EIS draft. We had to comment before the final, and on 11,000 pages within a time period very similar to this, 45 days. The final EIS will address the comments on the draft and identify, based on analysis and comments, the preferred alternative of the alternatives that they have chosen. The final EIS is not subject to public comment, only public review. As we wait for the draft EIS, the MDA, which is the Missile Defense Agency, which is within the U.S. Department of Defense, MDA released in June 2024 we're going to refer to today as the Guam Flight Test, Proposed Final Environmental Assessment, or EA for Environmental Assessment, Overseas Environmental Assessment, OEA. So this is for the Guam Flight Test. This new proposal is directly related to the MDA's plan to establish their proposed 360-degree EIA-MD system. The MDA states in the Guam Flight Test proposed EA that they prepared it, quote, to analyze the impacts of deploying and testing missile defense systems from Andersen Air Force Base on Guam or the broad ocean area of the Western Pacific Ocean. The involved agencies for the proposed final EA are MDA, Missile Defense Agency within DoD, that's the lead, the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, U.S. Coast Guard, the National Marine Fisheries Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Guam State Historic Preservation Office, and the Guam Bureau of Statistics and Plans consulted. The EA details MDA's plans to deploy and test missile defense systems, including up to 2 flight tests or tracking exercises per year from Andersen Air Force Base or at sea from a U.S. Navy ship underway in the broad ocean area of the Western Pacific Ocean for a period of 10 years. They state, quote, a flight test represents a target missile flight, an interceptor missile flight, an intercept of a target missile, or a test of sensors independent of missile flight. For a single flight test, multiple interceptors and targets may be utilized. A tracking exercise involves using sensors to scan and track a target with no interceptor, unquote. The proposed final EA includes a, quote, finding of no significant impact. This is abbreviated as a FONSI, finding of no significant impact in their environmental assessment. The FONSI is issued when environmental analysis and interagency review during environmental assessment process find the project to have no significant impacts on the quality of the environment. That document is the EA modified to reflect all applicable comments and responses. If it was not done in the environmental assessment, the FONSI must include the project sponsor's recommendation or selected alternative. This means that the MDA did not have to complete an environmental impact statement for the Guam flight test. That's the process we're in the middle of right now. Some areas of concern with the proposed final EA for the Guam flight test include environmental impacts, public safety, private landowners' rights. The document states that although the flight test may result in temporary public and private land access restriction in the Andersen Air Force Base vicinity, although the document or other public records do not explicitly state which landowners are going to be implicated with the proposed project set to begin late 2025. Numerous landowners, to our knowledge, have received letters in the mail from the U.S. military about the possibility of not being able to use their lands at certain periods over the course of 10 years. From May 30, 2024, Department of the Navy JRM letter to landowners, I quote, for the duration of this first test window, which is when the test event could occur, a team of Army and Navy representatives will request select landowners to agree to remain away from their private properties on the boundaries of Andersen Air Force Base to ensure their safety. This effort is necessary out of an abundance of caution. While there is a very small chance that the properties would be affected in the unlikely occurrence of an incident in the test period, the U.S. Indo-PACOM leadership is determined to ensure public safety to the maximum extent, while also performing this very important demonstration of the island's defensive capabilities. JRM leadership recently met with Guam leadership, including the mayors of Dedido and Jigo, to share the flight test plan and EA process, unquote. That's from the letter that was delivered or sent to landowners. Because of these concerns and the original 30-day public comment period that the MDA provided for the public to review the 370-page long document detailing the proposed Guam flight tests EA, I, along with others, sent official requests for a 60-day extension to the public comment period deadline to MDA Director Lieutenant General Heath Collins on June 11th. I further emailed Joint Region Marianas Rear Admiral Brent DeVore and Joint Region Micronesia Task Force Rear Admiral Gregory Huffman to ask for their support in my request to MDA Director Collins. Rear Admirals DeVore and Huffman responded saying that based on conversations they have had with MDA regarding the request for extension, an official reply from MDA Director Collins should be forthcoming. The reply from Director Collins came on June 21, 2024, and the letter detailed the following updates. The public comment period for the Guam flight test proposed final EA is extended until August 2, 2024. August 2, 2024. MDA, JRM, TFC, and JRM are offering their environmental and flight test experts to legislators for a briefing on July 23 and 24. MDA, JRM, TFC, and JRM will host a briefing session for the public on July 25, 2024. I will be involved in all of these efforts and encourage my colleagues to do the same. I've also asked the public to do all they can to be involved in this public comment period for the Guam flight test proposed final EA, because this proposed project will affect our community. In addition to requesting an extension and more information from MDA, I also sent letters to the Governor Lourdes Leon Guerrero and directors of Bureau of Statistics and Plans, Commission on Decolonization, Department of Land Management, Department of Agriculture, Department of Public Health and Social Services, the Department of Parks and Rec, and the SHPO's office, the Department of Public Works, Guam EPA, Guam GPA, and GWA, requesting that they send to my office their offices or agencies' preliminary or other findings regarding the proposed 360-degree EIA-MD system and the Guam flight test proposed final EA. I ask these so that we can publish these online so that everybody in the public can use these to inform themselves while they are making their comments in this comment period as well. So if they can see the agency's input, how it affects that one agency, so that they can better inform themselves when making their own comments. I received a response from SHPO and GPA, and I'm waiting for the others to respond. There still exists gaps in information regarding the overall proposed 360-degree EIA-MD system in Guam. And in an effort to gain more information for local leaders and the public before any more projects take place, or before the public comment period deadline ends, we've introduced Resolution 433-37. So this resolution, which is the subject of the hearing today, is requesting an assessment that, according to U.S. Public Law 117-263, the U.S. Department of Defense was supposed to do or commissioned to have done, and it did. It commissioned from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Lincoln Labs in 2023 an independent assessment of the integrated air and missile defense architecture to defend Guam. This was supposed to be due 180 days after passage of that law. June 21, 2023 was 180 days after the passage of Public Law 117-263. That's June 21, 2023. That's when the report should have been submitted by the Secretary of Defense to Congress. And it is not yet, and I confirmed this with the admirals today. We had a meeting, and they said it is still working its way through the Department of Defense. I'm concerned about this report not being available yet because of the comment period deadline. And it is concerning that the draft EIS is set to be released either before this independent assessment comes out or right around the same time. And this is especially concerning because the independent assessment report is supposed to look at purpose, integration, and housing and infrastructure capabilities in particular. And I thought that should be available to those people who are preparing the EIS and all of us who are going to comment on it. So we sent a letter to the Secretary of Defense requesting the independent assessment. And I also CC'd the Joint JRM and Joint Region Micronesia Task Force Command in this email. I've not received a response yet from the Secretary, but again, the admirals have told me that this report is being sent through DoD command up to the Secretary. Once the Secretary reviews it, the report will be sent to Congress, and then it will be released. It will be released to Congress. These admirals told me that they have requested for a non-confidential report as well that they could use to release to the public. I also sent a letter to our Congressman Moylan on June 27, requesting if he had received the unclassified report, and his response on July 2nd said, his team duly submitted the request and are in the process of obtaining the report. He continued saying, unfortunately, there is no definitive timeline for this process. However, he will undertake routine follow-ups with DoD. All right. So thank you for bearing with me on that introduction, but I thought it's important that we lay it out why we're seeking this report and why it's timely and has to be addressed right now. All right, and with that, I'd like to invite those who are here to provide testimony. Please come up. Former Congressman Robert Underwood, Sizos Masi for being here. Mr. Leland Bettis, Maniaca Flores. All right, Congressman Underwood, thank you again for being here. You may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and it's my privilege and honor to speak on behalf of your Resolution 433-37. Madam Speaker and members of the 37th Guam Legislature, thank you for the opportunity, providing the opportunity for the Pacific Center for Island Security to present our statement in support of this resolution. I'm Robert Underwood, and I'm chair of PCIS, and with me today is Leland Bettis, a fellow director of our organization. With your permission, I would like to provide some framing statements and then ask Leland to speak to one of the specific elements that Lincoln Labs was directed to assess, and that is a matter I believe very critical, the housing situation in Guam. First, let me say, as you've outlined, that this resolution is very timely. Based on our communication with Lincoln Labs, their assessment was transmitted to the Secretary of Defense last month. Given what is certain to be a high level of classification around some elements of the report, without an official prompt like this resolution, the Lincoln Labs assessment will likely never be released to the public. Without encouragement like this resolution, the Pentagon might not think about the content which needs not be classified, but which would be of benefit for the people of Guam to understand. So Resolution 433 then is important to bring more clarity to the issues which the military at both the national and local level. Generally, I believe that we in Guam need to be pushing much harder for transparency in what the military is planning for our community. We should not be taken for granted in decisions the military is making, and that loop of communications should not be narrow and limited to just elected officials. Transparency and access to information are the critical blocks, not just for an informed citizenry, but for a healthy democracy. As Christopher Delore, Secretary General of Reporters Without Borders, said, none of the main issues which humanity is facing will be resolved without access to information. But transparency and access to information are themselves not the main objectives. Transparency increases credibility and accountability, which should be simultaneously, ironically, I believe, important to military planners, civilian overseers, as well as our island community. The issues that Lincoln Labs was asked to assess involve two critical elements. First was whether the risk around MDA's proposed missile defense architecture capability, as well as the development and integration risk of the architecture. These are important questions, since what is being thrust upon our community has never been done before. There are serious questions about how well it would actually work, especially under stress. Some of the issues around the architecture are certain to be classified. For example, we asked Lincoln Labs, what level of confidence was expected of the system by Indo-PACOM, the general effectiveness assumptions of the models they were using, and what were the measures of success being considered. For example, 80% confidence that they will destroy 80% of incoming missiles. They politely demurred. Still, not all of the technical questions about the EIMDS should be classified. As noted in Resolution 433, the Pentagon's Directorate of Testing and Evaluation Unclassified report for the past 2 years has identified the architecture for the proposed EIMDS as not being sufficient. The point is that some of this technical assessment should be unclassified. The second area which Lincoln Labs assessed, the availability of housing and infrastructure on Guam needed to support the needed anticipated manning levels. I don't know why we still use manning as for increased personnel. I guess we'll have to rearrange that language. Should clearly be unclassified. For us in Guam, this hits home directly. As Leland will discuss, the military's past and current planning to accommodate military personnel, contractors, and foreign labor in Guam is clearly inadequate. At best, you could excuse it as being unmindful. At worst, it is an abysmal failure. The Lincoln Labs assessments about housing and infrastructure is critical for us to be aware of and to discuss as a community. We need to make sure that the military addresses issues of concern to Guam and not simply ignore the consequences of their own actions. More broadly, the Lincoln Labs report points to a much larger problem of information and the military sharing information with the community. The military likes to deal with these issues with briefings, press releases, staged events, closed-door meetings, and not serious dialogue. There's never been a public hearing where you could have a conversation with anybody. The Guam Chamber of Commerce, as a, quote, partner in progress with JRM and JTF Micronesia, is not a community forum on its own. The Chamber has its role in our community, but it is not empowered or elected to make decisions for the community as a whole. Then there are the meetings of the Civil Military Coordination Council. I'm having a hard time keeping track of all these organizations. CMCC, which include military representatives and GovGuam agencies. According to the GRM, the CMCC was established in 2010, that's 14 years ago, to foster collaboration among DoD, local government, and federal agencies to share information, discuss, and where warranted, provide recommendations to address military activity and growth with the goal of minimizing negative stressors to community infrastructure and services. If this, in fact, is the CMCC's goal, then it, like military housing to house its personnel and contractors in Guam, is clearly a failure. What is the information discussed? What warranted recommendations have been made? Who made these recommendations? Were these recommendations followed? We simply do not know because the military does not want these meetings open to the public. The Lincoln Labs assessment also raises a host of questions about other Guam-directed studies and strategies that will have broad and lasting impacts on our community, but seem to be stuck in Washington. Let me just raise two of them. The fiscal year 2024 National Defense Authorization Act directed the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of the Air Force to brief the Committee on Armed Services of the Senate and the House of Representatives by March 2024 on a plan in executing the emergency movement of munitions stored in weapons storage areas in Joint Region Marianas, Guam, onto aircraft and naval vessels. Emergency is clearly related to wartime requirements, but the movement will be on our roads. Understanding what this means to our community is important. It also needs to be put into context of the claims from Guam's delegate about a House-approved $14.9 million appropriation and $149 million authorization to suddenly improve Guam's roads. We encourage the legislature to request information from both JRM and the Guam delegate on this issue. We are the #1 U.S. target in war. There's no doubt about that. We're the #1 U.S. target in case of war in this part of the world. And we deserve to be treated with at least the respect of transparency about our risk. The fiscal year 2024 National Defense Authorization Act also had a requirement for the submission to the House and Senate Defense Committees a strategy for ground-based theater-range conventional missiles in the Indo-Pacific region that also covered shorter-range missile systems. Excuse me. It is no secret that now Guam is being considered as a site to host offensive intermediate-range ballistic missiles. But this is not part of the military's public conversation or discussion. These days, JRM, the MDA, and the delegate are busy selling, quote, the defense of Guam as part of the U.S. homeland, not the offense that is capable coming from Guam. We encourage the legislature to request information from both JRM and JRF Micronesia and Guam's delegate on this issue. We need an honest discussion about the military's plans for Guam and to clarify what it is that they expect us to do or not do in the defense of Guam. U.S. military policy and plans related to Guam have a significant impact on our community. It is important that these objectives be understood so that the people of Guam are not the last to know about decisions being made in Washington for them. More significantly, we need to be included in meaningful ways about the path forward. Guam's sole non-voting delegate to the U.S. Congress, and I know this from personal example, cannot be expected to bend the will of the federal government to every Guam need or desire. But keeping the people of Guam informed about Guam-specific legislation, strategies, and plans that impact our lives is an important baseline. Joint Region Marianas and Joint Task Force Micronesia have an obligation to be forthcoming about ongoing plans. Oblique environmental assessments and scoping meetings, some of which you outline in your beginning remarks, which tell us very little in the way of specifics, is simply not an acceptable standard for respectful and open military-civilian relationships in the 21st century. Madam Speaker and members of the Guam legislature, this is our island. We really need to start requiring those who want to use it understand that we are not simply colonial vassals that are satisfied with incomplete information and inadequate participation in decision-making processes. The use of pronouns is instructive. Chamorro clarifies our in ways that English does not. This is Islan Mami, our island, not including those whom we are speaking to. This is not Islata, our island, including the people we are speaking to. When we speak to the military command, we should be saying, Islan Mami, por favor. With that, Madam Speaker, and with your permission, I'd like Leland to speak briefly to the military's failure to meet basic shelter requirements for their personnel in this ongoing buildup.
Congressman Underwood. Mr. Bettis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. For the record, I'm Leland Bettis, Director at the Pacific Center for Island Security. I would like to briefly address one of the issues that Lincoln Labs, by law, was required to address in their assessment that has been now sent to the Secretary of Defense. Specifically, Lincoln Labs was asked to assess the impact on housing from the manning levels, their words, related to the MDA's proposed Enhanced Integrated Air Missile Defense System. It seems likely that the MDA shared with Lincoln Labs the number of personnel and contractors expected to support the missile defense architecture that's being put in place. But for those of us directly affected by the system, those of us that live here, it's important to note that with all of the talk about the rollout of the EIA-MDS, the U.S. military has not, to date, publicly released what that number of personnel or contractors or supporting personnel is. But even without that number, housing is a capacity crisis that is with us already. Everyone knows there's a housing problem in Guam that is exacerbated by the military pushing its housing shortage problem outside of the fence. The impact military personnel and the overseas housing allowance have put on the local housing market is not a secret. Everyone knows this. But today, there's no transparency around the impact of military personnel and contractors in the local market. We don't have a count on the number of military personnel living off base. We don't have a dollar figure for how much the military is spending for housing in the civilian community. There's no comprehensive data set related to the military in the Guam housing market. If there is a plan, it must be classified because the information is clearly not readily and publicly available. Today, the military approach to housing in the civilian community is simply a pump and dump scheme. Pump military housing requirements into Guam and dump the housing problem outside the fence. In the absence of a master planning data set, we're left with pieces of information. What we do know is that based on the military's own budget documents for fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25, and even with over $400 million in the pipeline for an additional 281 units for the Marines moving from Okinawa, the Marines will still need 1,750 off-base houses by 2029. The failure in planning is clear from the fact that the $400 million in the pipeline for Marine housing comes over a decade after DoD submission of the Guam Master Plan in 2014. It comes 15 years after the signing of the Guam International Agreement between the governments of the United States and Japan. Put another way, 20 years after planning to move the Marines to Guam, they're still going to be 1,750 units short by 2029, even after the recent rash of housing units has been built. Recently documented plans for 12 Republic of Singapore Air Force F-15 fighters to be based at Andersen Air Force Base by 2029 involve 240 personnel, and this is going to add to the off-base housing shortage, or the on-base housing shortage. Given the level of poor planning for housing and the apparent expectation that the civilian market will absorb any impact, perhaps it is not surprising that the Air Force, in their draft environmental impact statement, quote, assumed that all personnel would reside in off-installation housing on Guam, end quote. Taken together, by 2029, and even after having spent $400 million on on-base housing, the Marines and Air Force personnel at Andersen Air Force Base will require 2,000 units in the civilian community. The military's failure to plan for housing the U.S. Marine Corps personnel moving from Okinawa is just a small part of the problem. To be clear, the military also recognizes this problem, it's just not doing very much about it. The EIA MDS requirements for housing that Lincoln Labs assessed will add to the cumulative impact of the problem. Over the longer horizon, an increasing number of military operational units are being planned for Guam, and as JRM has estimated, the military population in Guam will increase 41% over the next 13 years. So, again, the Pentagon knows there's a problem, but they're not doing much about it. But let me give you some examples of, how we know they know there's a problem. The fiscal year 24 National Defense Authorization Act requires the Secretary of Defense to brief the House and the Senate Armed Services Committees by the end of this year with an assessment of the current and future housing needs for assigned personnel, options to meet the current and future housing needs, and ways to mitigate the impact of the military personnel in the local housing market. I should also note that this briefing by the Secretary of Defense really was a downgrade from what earlier had been a call for an independent assessment for these very items. Secondly, the FY24 NDAA gives the Secretary of Navy unusual authority to address housing needs in Guam as civilian contractors are giving housing allowances. So the way that they propose the Secretary of the Navy address this is by reimbursing costs associated with the rehabilitation of private residences that house Navy civilian employees performing work in Apra Harbor. And just as a corollary to that, the House version of the fiscal year 25 NDAA makes all DoD civilians in Guam eligible for off-base housing allowance. So the problem just keeps multiplying even while they recognize their problem. The Navy in February of this year had a request for information soliciting ideas for solutions to, quote, accommodate the housing requirements of 1,000 to 4,000 additional accompanied and unaccompanied service members on the island of Guam. The status of that is outstanding. And then the Department of Defense fiscal year 25 budget submission includes a notification that the Department of Navy plans to conduct a housing requirements market analysis in FY25 for 3 installations: Camp Blas, Naval Support Activity at Andersen Air Force Base, and Naval Base Guam. The Guam locations are 3 of 19 system-wide where the Navy will conduct a housing requirements market analysis in FY25. The question is, what is being done to address the problem? Without transparency, more information, coordinated planning, adequate funding, the civilian housing sector in Guam appears likely to continue to absorb increasing numbers of military personnel. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
So just want to see Mr. Bettis. I'm finding this testimony very, very useful. Thank you. If you can hold on for a minute and some questions. Ms. Flores.
Hafa Speaker Terlaje, thank you for providing us this opportunity to testify on Resolution 433-37, and thank you for introducing it. A lot of community members are really familiar with the commenting processes on various programmatic agreement memos, EIS and draft EIS, and a lot of the studies associated are not available. If they are, they're heavily redacted. A lot of us have the experience of, requesting for these materials using the Freedom of Information Act, and it being quite difficult and time-consuming, and actually we don't even get a lot of these things till way after the comment periods are closed. And so we appreciate that the legislature is taking this step toward transparency to get this information, this report to the public, because we are left in the dark, as the gentleman said before me. For those of us who've even started to look at the EA for the missile testing, we find it very challenging. There is a lack of information, but also we don't agree with and we want to challenge the finding of no significant impacts, the FONSIs. It's really frustrating to read over and over again that there's no significant impacts. No significant impacts to air emissions, no significant impacts to cultural properties, to private properties, to traffic, to housing. None of it is accurate. And it feels like it's just being completely ignored by the department. It's offensive, and it is harmful to everybody who calls Guam home. And even the briefing that's going to take place on the 25th and the extension of the comment period is only possible because of the request of our island's officials. I'm here today as a member of Terlaje Savertidian. My name is Monica Flores, and it's also really important that we just come out now ahead of all of this and just say we're also just against the testing. We also just don't want the testing. The people also say no to the missile defense system and the missile defense testing, and it's because of all of the things that we have to really measure against this continued violence, this continued militarization and colonial violence to our island and our people. We have to measure everything against several decades of environmental racism and injustice, and that's really important here. Our islands are being consumed by a leviathan. We were talking about earlier before the hearing, some of us here, that the military-industrial complex is consuming the island, and that there's absolutely no transparency about the extent of burdens and harms that our island is forced to endure. We are impacted, like I said, of decades of environmental destruction and contamination, the desecration of indigenous lands and resources, gendered and sexual violence, and the increased climate crisis challenges and superstorms because of the use of fossil fuels by the Department of Defense, cycles of poverty, coerced loyalty and dependence, and a complete disregard to our self-determination and the decolonization of our islands. Up to 2 times a year for the next 10 years, the Department of Defense plans to launch missiles from the air, land, and sea and intentionally collide them over the Pacific Ocean. A typical test will last about 8 hours. These tests pollute our ocean with debris from the missile collisions, parachutes, pallets, batteries, hazardous chemicals, hundreds of lines, expended parts of the missiles, and possibly entire missiles. DoD intends to leave these floating around or lying at the bottom of the ocean floor. These tests will also limit access to fishing grounds and private properties near Andersen Air Force Base. Public lands occupied, including Chamorro lands such as Letexan and also Terlaje, as well as privately held lands such as Inapsan and Arunau, will be impacted. Private landowners will not be able to access their properties until after the test, which the Department of Defense estimates could be 8 hours to 4 days. And as you mentioned earlier, Speaker, a very generic and insensitive, patronizing letter has been sent to landowners, and I did provide a copy earlier. I'm glad that you have one that was received by one of Terlaje's members. The test will also release greenhouse gases, worsening the climate crisis through its fossil fuel use. They will further threaten our endangered plant and animal species, including sea turtles, whales, fruit bats, and tree snails. And missile parts and debris could fall on land and sea plants and animals. Parachute lines could entangle sea life. Animals could ingest the debris. Debris could settle on coral and sponges. There will also be an increase in noise pollution in areas, specifically the areas of Jigo and Dedido, nearby residences, schools, and churches. These are our most populated villages. The sounds of missile launches, collisions, and parts landing on land and in the ocean will harm and startle pets and wildlife. And again, they will introduce hazardous, toxic, and carcinogenic pollution into our air, land, and sea. The thing that I think is most striking is when you're reading the EA and it says that there are no significant impacts. There are no significant impacts. There's no need for mitigation. There's no need for us to really look at these issues, is what they're saying. But if there's no significant impacts, why are they going to restrict access to people from their homes, from their ranches, for up to 4 days? They're showing us that their sovereign immunity to do whatever they want to people and land is not just limited to the base, that they could also carry it outside of the base. And this is an extreme injustice that we have to say no to right now and today. And as you know, these gentlemen have said time and time again and have reported to our community, there's a lot of research that shows that this kind of military testing and training only increases tension in the region and can provoke a conflict. And so we're here today to say we refuse to be a first strike community. We refuse to be the tip of the spear, and we want no war for Guam and the Marianas. Thank you very much. Sana Masi.
This is Masi, Manyaca Flores, and PLSR. Okay, questions. Congressman, I'm trying to find in your testimony the line where you said we are at greatest risk of all the U.S. Was there a line in your testimony where you said, I'm trying to find that, that we are the greatest target or the most at risk?
Yes, we are. We are the greatest target. We're the number one target.
We're the number one target.
Yeah, we're the number one target.
For offensive missiles coming our way.
Well, we're the number one target for a number of reasons, but of course, having offensive missiles here obviously increases that as well.
All right. Can you describe what you think architecture not being sufficient, or that conclusion that it was not sufficient?
Well, yes, I think that preliminary, investigations and estimates have said that the way that the architecture is designed is not operable for the foreseeable future. But instead of either perfecting that or working on it, they have apparently decided to go ahead with their plan. So the Lincoln Labs assessment of that from them, and maybe people are not generally aware of who the Lincoln Labs are. They're a unit of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and so, but they are partially federally funded, so there is some, I wouldn't say collusion, but there's some level of cooperation or collaboration, and so they're supposed to do a kind of an independent assessment of the viability of this system. Now, if I was to sit here and just think about all the things that were going on, like this missile testing, last week I was getting a driver's license, standing in a long line there at Revan Tax, and one person came up to me whose land is affected by this, and he said, "This is land taking by another name." Because essentially what they're doing is they're restricting their capacity to use their land for at least 10 years in a way that they may want to. We don't know. Maybe they want to build something down there. Maybe they want to construct a business. But now this is sort of land taking in another way. And then we have the appearance of the Singapore Air Force on Guam. And then we have this incomplete report, or it's a completed report, but not been released. And, it seems like there's just an intensity of activity, and it's like bits and pieces that are coming out little by little, rather than having us understand the whole panoply of their proposed activities so that we can engage in it in a meaningful way. So I just hasten to add that this is not a reflexive refusal to every possible activity that they have, but they're not, we don't know all the activities. And the systems that are supposed to be in place to allow transparency, to allow some semblance of accountability are not yet perfected. They've been promised in the past, but they haven't really been fully implemented. And so now, what we have seen instead is an increased number of military commands being established here. We have more stars here than ever before, both from the Army and the Navy. I'm starting to see stars all the time now, and and in a way, it's like the way we're being dealt with. It's like one after the other. And you of course, if you indicate your opposition, you could be characterized as being disloyal or unmindful or naive or any of those things. But this is not that. This is a plea for accountability. This is a plea for respect. This is a plea for engaging people where they're at. And their failure to do that, and I'll say that, I think they have failed to do that. And their failure to do that has, instead of increasing confidence in their activity, has increased a lack of confidence in their activities, a lack of, increased a higher level of concern about whether they're really telling us all that they know. And in the meantime, of course, you have this whole possibility of every kind of weapon systems and technology and electricity, even the mini nuclear power plants. All of these activities are starting to be discussed, and it seems like if you were inside the Beltway and you had a weapon system that you wanted to test, or you had an idea that hasn't been brought to fulfillment yet, and you're looking for the moving vehicle to attach that idea to, that moving vehicle is Guam. So I'm going to attach everything that I do, and I'm going to say, this is for that very important place, Guam. And I'm going to suggest everything. So now you have all of these range of activities. I just find it, particularly the missile testing one, I just find it kind of, well, it's disappointing, but, they would never do that to Hawaii. You wouldn't get a letter that says, aloha, we're going to do missile testing in Hawaii. Yet you get a letter here that says, hafa a day. It's like a friendly letter.
We're going to do testing, and you might have to vacate your property for periods of time.
It's I guess that's the Chamorro equivalent of dear sir, I don't know, it's like that's so uproarious. It's so disrespectful. And I don't know who got this. I know, obviously, Muñeca knows some landowners who got it, but there may be other landowners who never got it, and because we don't know anything about it. And so that just speaks to a level of lack of transparency and a lack of openness. And a fact, of course, here's a resolution that concerns them, and of course they're not here, because they're taking comfort or some kind of maybe misunderstood level of comfort that they can be able to just wait this out. Just wait to that. You ask for 60 days, we'll give you 30, and then we'll wait it out. Well, I want people to know there are other avenues. There's lawsuits. There's legal action. There's protests. There's lots of different things that can happen until they start taking us seriously. And up to this point, I don't think they are.
Do you, when you talked about how it was the Pentagon's Directorate of Testing and Evaluation that said that the architecture for the proposed missile defense system is not being sufficient. It was the Pentagon's report. And now it's being independently assessed by the lab, Lincoln Labs from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology,
That's right.
MIT. And that's for the defensive missile system. But you also mentioned in your testimony that they are also involved in or being considered to host offensive intermediate range ballistic missiles. Is that similarly studied, like the reliability of the architecture, I guess?
So that's a great question. Just to go back, so the insufficiency of the architecture has to do with the overall design.
Okay.
And how the component pieces fit together. There's many component pieces, as you laid out in your opening statement: command and control, launchers, sensors. All these things have to work together, and how they work together is really critical. Many pieces of this are still in development. Some of them have just gone into fielding. Some of them are still in testing. Some of them are in development. And I'll give you an example. One of the radars that they plan to use in Guam for the 360-degree system, they couldn't quite figure out how to get the 360 to work, so they go, we're going to do 180 for a while, then we'll do the other 180. And at some point, they've got to make the two 180s come together. But I'm just giving you an example of sort of why things might not be considered sufficient. So the question of an offensive missile next to, first of all, air defense systems, which are sort of knockdown airplanes and cruise missiles and things which suggest that an enemy would be firing them fairly close by. Those have to interact with anti-ballistic missile systems. So, and those are two very different kinds of systems. They sense their targets differently, they target them differently, and they strike them differently. So how those things are all integrated is a big deal. So we actually asked the Lincoln Labs people about the question of the offensive missiles, and their response to us was, well, we don't have time to consider that because of the limited framework that we have in terms of our task from the Secretary of Defense. Of course, it's a big problem. If you start adding an offensive missile system on top of a defensive system, then the potential of confusing targeting and how your sensors work is further complicated. But to the Congressman's point, I think what's happening now is, it's pile on everything in Guam. I mean, defense contractors are talking about, we just saw testing of a balloon system that effectively allows them to use command and control and to get ground-based sensors if satellites are out. This just happened in Valiant Shield just last month. So, they're trying all kinds of things out in Guam because, Guam is a high-risk target. If, there's going to be lack of access to Guam in the event of conflict. So, all the things they're piling on, I think, is sort of a reflection of the peril which they see coming to Guam in the event of conflict.
All of that, yeah. So we are the designated Mariana Islands training and testing area, the largest in the world, training and testing of, like you described, and that's why they do their exercises, I guess, in our waters and lands. But do you know, so Manyaka had talked about, this is like racial bias. And I know that was discussed when the testing was being done in the Marshall Islands, in the Cold War years ago. So this feels like, I don't know, to me, it's coming back again. I mean, very clear. People maybe had excuses not to see it clearly at that time, but we have no excuse to see that clearly. And you're describing Guam being used for many, many things. I had asked the new admiral for JRM if he had participated in this type of missile testing anywhere else, and he said, yeah, Vieques. And I'm wondering if you know if there are any other places in the United States where they do missile defense testing.
I don't know the answer to that question, but they're no longer in Vieques. That I do know. And they're no longer in Vieques because the people of Puerto Rico spoke up. So the racial dimension to this is part of it, but I think a bigger part of it is the political dimension. is the relative weight, the political weight you have, the capacity to say no. And so obviously, if you're a state, you have 2 senators, you have all kinds of things, political power points which you can exercise. But Guam doesn't have those power points. And so I think they can afford to treat us with a little bit more cavalier attitude, if you will. Now, that could have ethnic or racial overtones, but it's really about powerlessness. If you don't have the power to say no, or you don't have the real power to slow things down, then you're just an obstacle that we can deal with in due time. And so this is, I think this is the sense of what we're experiencing now. Now, they did do, many years ago, they did do some of this missile testing off the coast of Hawaii, where they did, and I don't think they do that anymore there as well. But I think that was the Aegis missile testing off of ships. But the idea that you could write a letter to the residents of Los Angeles or Honolulu and say, you know, aloha or hafa day, and you know, we're going to do missile testing, and you might have to leave your property for a few days. It would be unthinkable that that would be attempted anywhere. But here, it seems like it's okay, because for whatever reason, inside the Pentagon, the intensity of what they're thinking is so important and so critical that they can simply disregard and treat people in a cavalier way. And that's the issue. And of course, the individuals who represent them here, you know, it's kind of like a sort of a shell game. You know, if you ask them about missile defense, they say, well, that's not our department. We're not missile defense. But then, of course, they did respond to some things as if they did know. It's like they're uncoordinated. It's like, that's not my job. And well, what is your job? What is the role of, you know, JRM and Joint Task Force Micronesia, and how does all this fit in? Because we can't simply deal with a shifting cast of characters, which has always been an issue. And that's now you're not only dealing with a changing cast of characters, you're dealing with a shifting group. You're dealing with multiple groups, and you're expected. And, you know, poor PCIS, which is just me, Leland, and Ken Cooper for now, we're expected to sort of like analyze what the whole Pentagon is doing, and it's unrealistic, and we're doing the best we can, and we're doing it on the basis of an appeal to honesty and transparency, as these young people are as well, you know, because maybe some of these concerns can be assuaged. Maybe they cannot be assuaged at all. But we know now that the level of communication is pretty low.
Madam Speaker, just
Yes.
a technical point. Missile testing is usually conducted on a range. So White Sands, Vandenberg Air Force Base, the Ronald Reagan Missile Defense Range, all those things are ranges where missile tests normally are conducted, and that's over areas that are, you know, widely uninhabited, or in the ocean, over areas that are widely uninhabited. So I don't believe what we're seeing is a request to set up a range here. I suspect the bar would be pretty high to set up a range. So the EA around this first Guam, you know, flight plan piece appears to be sort of trying to short circuit what would normally be establishment of a range. That's effectively what they're doing over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I was going to ask about
The second piece is it's important to note, and this is directly related to that. The U.S. government in the late teens had to set up a process to provide the government of Japan with an Aegis Ashore battery, which would allow the Japanese government to set up standard missile 3s to shoot from land. In 2020, the Japanese National Security Council politely declined that offer. And the principal reason they declined it was because of the fallout of the debris from booster debris in their communities. They didn't want it. So the Japanese are moving towards something, and will have by, in the next 4 or 5 years, a system of Aegis onboard ships. And they're building the most advanced Aegis vessels in the world. that they're going to use offshore. So the U.S. government does this now with Aegis vessels. There are Aegis vessels in Guam today which perform many of the things that they're talking about doing from shore with the enhanced integrated missile defense system. It's just the Navy doesn't want to spend the money and tie up their ships to have this mission on a regular basis. So they're planning to, the thought is to try to move that ashore to Guam. But there are many complications when you start doing that.
All right, thank you for reminding. Yeah, we did have that discussion earlier about the offshore is what being currently used, but this is the new part of this is to bring it on land. And all right, what the 10-year period is that lending to your argument that this is like the indirect way of establishing a range, like a permanent range, as opposed to a single or set of tests?
It sure seems like it, because then what I think contemplated over time is this whole area of ocean east of us is going to be used as a range. And so right now it's used for different training exercises, but not this kind of activity.
Right.
So now that you're going to have this 10-year window of opportunity, of course they're saying, how many times a year are they saying? Twice a year. Well, there's nothing to change that to 4 times a year once this is approved.
Right, of course.
I mean, it could be changed. It's like a kind of a moving target. It's the same thing with the firing
They will
range.
say no impact because it's already being done.
That's right.
That's their famous line.
Yeah.
So
And just technically, if you're doing a 360-degree system, right now this missile test is only pointed in a northeasterly direction from Guam. I don't think that's where the missiles are probably going to be coming from. So, I think, the knock-on effect of this is you're going to have, if it's going to be realistic, you're going to have a real 360-degree capability. You've got to be able to fire a missile from Guam from any direction.
So
And you have to have a cooperative enemy.
a cooperative enemy to go right where we want them,
I'm shooting you from here.
where we have tested. So yeah, they're going to want to test 360 degrees, right, eventually. And so I did ask, where is this aimed and where will it land? And miles off the shore, miles offshore, northeast, that's all I could get. And, but is what Muñeca said correct, that the debris will remain where it lands and most of the parts and things? I mean, that's just debris for the ocean?
There will be some debris that lands in Guam. So the debris from the booster phase of the rocket will land in Guam. So that's, that was actually the big concern of the Japanese was, as they described in the EA, it's a 6-foot by 2-foot, 500-pound booster that will drop. And they have, what they call a potential drop area, but, that's where it actually drops is probably a much bigger question. And, these rockets, they have been tested. They're fairly mature, but they also do malfunction every once in a while. I think that's part of the concern about landowners, is what happens if a rocket malfunctions, if it explodes after takeoff, what happens to debris, what if it explodes on the ground. They have their own safety requirements, even when they're doing testing, to compensate for some of those things, but those obviously are something that has to be taken into consideration.
Speaker, if I can read from the EA, it does say the remaining inert debris would impact the ocean surface and sink to the seafloor within model debris field. And they do acknowledge that some of the boosters may fall in, quote, wooded areas around the island. So these are, these are things that are in the EA. Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And so just a reminder again, so this is a test of like one direction, you're saying, but they do intend to set up 360 degrees around the island. We set 20 sites at least, right, for different components. Is it likely that then the impacts that we're seeing, this land use restrictions or debris, hazardous materials, that those will impact other parts of the island after this test is done, when they want to test for the rest of the 360 degrees?
Don't hold your breath. I mean, I expect at some point they're going to have to test the missile in other directions.
right? Including, they have one site set up in the south, either between Yamatic and Maritza, right?
Well, we don't really, again, you know.
They didn't tell us
they have
which
not told us-
component is going where.
They have not told us where sensors are, where radars are, where shooters are. We don't know.
Right. All right. But, so that's what we have to guess about, but I guess we could say that from the information we know, those are the risks that we are facing. And so, again, thank you for your testimony. I hope everybody on Guam can hear this. Yes, I want to ask Dr. Underwood, especially you, with your experience in Congress, and you're telling us it's our political capacity to say no that is really going to be our only real tool here. And we've read it in the reports. We've read it over the years where they say we can do this on Guam because we can, right? It's because they believe politically they can do it here where they are not allowed to do it in Japan. They are not allowed to do it in any other island. They are not allowed to do it in any other state that they believe, that they can because the resistance on Guam is low, or they control it, Guam. So, I'm sure you are not spending these years of your life wasting your time trying to educate us on this and trying to, advocate that we really just get the information and that information gets to all the people of Guam, and that I intend to help. I am not discouraged or I'm not giving up, and I'm encouraged by your support or your help in leading us in this. And I just want to know our political capacity to say no. I believe we have that, despite our status, that we can if we are united. That's really the key for me, is like, if we are united, I really believe we will be able to do that in some level. How do you feel? I know you said it can't be just the government, it can't be elected leaders only, but I think it should be elected leaders first, or at least they have to be definitely on board. And what is your success with that? I mean, with other elected leaders in Guam, are we going to get unison on this?
Well, you make a very important point, and so the power to say no does not exist in Guam. Doesn't mean you don't have power to slow things down. It doesn't mean that you don't have power to use existing legal systems to slow things down. But the absolute power to say no exists, like in the compact states. They can say no, or in an independent country. But what I find most interesting is when an elected official here says they want to leverage something with the military. So if you're going to leverage something with the military, that implies that you believe that you have the power to say no. Otherwise, there's no leverage. What's your leverage? If I'm going to leverage the military into doing something I want, they must want me to agree to something that I may withhold agreement on. And so, while I've heard a lot of conversation about leverage, I haven't heard anyone step up and say, well, this is the line I'm drawing. I'm drawing it here, and I'm not going to accept it I'm not going to agree to it unless you give me X or you give me B. The other point is that you're absolutely correct, that with a united front, you can end it. And that's what Puerto Rico did with Vieques. So I was on the Armed Services Committee, and the military predicted total disaster if they had to close down Vieques. But Vieques was closed down due to Puerto Rican pressure, due to Puerto Ricans who live in the U.S. pressure, and they finally closed it down. Of course, the response of the Department of Defense was to close down Roosevelt roads in Puerto Rico. They closed down bases. They did everything they could to kind of indicate their displeasure, but Vieques is closed. And so it is possible, but it takes extraordinary effort for a non-self-governing territory to do that. And whatever you can call Puerto Rico, it's a non-self-governing territory too. So that in that sense, it is possible. But it takes extraordinary effort. But I'm more interested, you know, in trying to open up the avenues from forcing the Pentagon and the Department of Defense to be more transparent in their planning and more engaged with the community than they are currently. Because it's not just that the U.S. has views that they have absolute sovereignty over Guam. I remember Marine Corps Commandant, U.S. Marine Corps Commandant who visited the Philippines, then he visited Japan, then he went to Korea, and he had a pretty grueling trip trying to explain what the Marines were doing. And then when he got to Guam, his first comment, which was quoted in the newspaper, was, well, I'm glad to get someplace where we own it. So, you know, that's a general attitude. That's not an extending a hand of friendship. That's like exercising a hand of power. And, you know, to date, that has not been sufficiently challenged. But you're right, there are avenues and there are ways we can do that. And I think this resolution is one way. And the exercise of lawsuits and the exercise of constant efforts to open it up. And I think even our small efforts in the Pacific Center for Island Security, which are really devoted not to be contrary to everything the military, but to open it up so that people know that they have options and to know that there are impacts that are not being addressed and impacts that they are responsible for addressing. And that if this were a different community, they would be addressing them in a different way. And I think that's pretty clear. That's not just a stance on military activities. That's really a stance on standing up for your island.
Made a very good list of specific activities that really pose risks, increase the target, and cause some harm. Yeah, and thank you for really going deep dive on the housing.
So let me just add one last thing, just to sort of drive the point home, and that Congressman Underwood was talking about. If we take 30% of the median household income in Guam based on the 2020 census, so just a little less than 60,000, 30%, let's just say back of the envelope is $1,500. That's what you have for housing. That's the benchmark, all the federal rules set up for how much of your income you should allocate for housing. The fair market value of a 3-bedroom unit in Guam today for rental is $2,500. The enlisted man that's making less than $35,000 a year under the Overseas Housing Allowance Program is given for his rent and his utilities and other sundry costs about $4,000 a month. So, you know, this is putting real pressure on the housing market today. This is not something, a threat in the future. This is happening today. And the military simply has not stepped up and planned for the impact of their personnel in Guam. The overcrowding in Guam houses is 300% of the national average. It's 30% higher than Hawaii, which everyone says is unacceptable. It's a real failure on the part of military planners to address this.
Thank you again. Is there anything you'd like to say before we end, Dr. Underwood? If not, then Situs Masi again, and thank you. And there being no further testimony, this hearing is concluded. It is 5:35 p.m. Sainamasi.